Good evening and welcome to this event, Scotland 2045, A Sustainable Society. My name is Alison Johnston, MSP. I'm Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament and I'll be the chair for our discussion this evening. Tonight's debate is presented by the Scottish Parliament's Festival of Politics in partnership with Scotland's Futures Forum. The Festival of Politics is where the Parliament and the people can come together to debate the big issues of the day. Our main festival will run in October and we're delighted to hold this event in the lead up to it. The Futures Forum exists to create space in Parliament to lift our eyes from the immediate priorities of our day-to-day work, to give us an opportunity to consider our long-term future, to look beyond the electoral cycle to the challenges, the opportunities that face us over the coming decades. And there can be no bigger challenge and opportunity than that of creating a sustainable society, one that exists within environmental boundaries and provides a safe and secure life for all its citizens. That is the ambition that Scotland has set itself, with various targets for reaching net zero, eliminating poverty, and achieving a just transition. Tonight, we will explore what that long-term future could look like. We have three great panellists, and we're keen to hear from those of you joining us in the audience. You can use the Q&A function on the right of the screen to ask questions, as well as to like those asked by others. Put your questions in there, and we will get through as many as we can. As I said, tonight's topic is Scotland in 2045. Without changing how we live our lives in the coming years, we will experience ever more destructive biodiversity loss and climate change in our country and planet. In tackling these twin challenges, Scotland aims for a just transition, tackling poverty and improving people's lives. But what does a sustainable Scotland look like? How can we build a society that works for all its citizens? And what changes do we need to make as individuals to bring it about? To discuss these questions and more, I'm delighted to welcome a wonderful panel. Zarina Ahmad is a climate leader and campaigner. Since being told that ethnic minorities aren't interested in climate change, Zarina has dedicated herself to supporting underrepresented groups who work in environmental organisations. She was recently named as one of the top 30 influential women in environment by Women's Hour on BBC Radio 4. As well as many roles in climate organisations, Zarina is currently studying for a PhD on sustainability at the University of Manchester. James Robertson is a poet, editor and novelist. His novels, including Joseph Knight and The Land Lay Still and The Professor of Truth, have won numerous prizes, while The Testament of Gideon Mack was longlisted for the 2006 Man Booker Prize. His books have explored various aspects of Scottish history, society and culture, and he has been described as the chronicler of Scotland on more than one occasion. His most recent novel, News of the Dead, came out in August. Catherine Trebek is a writer, researcher and an advocate for economic system change. Her main work is on the well-being economy, an economy that delivers for people and the planet. Catherine is co-founder of the Global Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and she helped instigate the Wellbeing Economy Governments Group, which counts amongst its members the governments from New Zealand, Finland, Iceland, Wales and Scotland. Catherine recently co-authored the book, The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. I guess we may hear some of those ideas this evening. As I said, tonight is to get us all looking to our future, and I'll start by asking our panel, what does a sustainable Scotland look like for you? What has to change about our current lives? And what could or should stay the same? We'll go to Zarina first, followed by James, and then Catherine. Zarina.
So thinking about a vision for what Scotland could look like. And I suppose I'm an idealist, so it might be a big vision and people might think, oh, this is not possible or would be impractical even. So The way I see Scotland would probably be a move away from like urbanised areas for a start, right? So that we're not all living in densely populated cities and congregating around like offices and concrete buildings, and moving more to be connected to nature. So taking up more space across Scotland. But when I say that, I don't mean taking over the space either, but living in harmony with our natural environment and being part of that natural environment is really important for me. This is my own personal vision. It might be everybody else's vision, but it is my own personal vision. At a societal level, I would say I'm very much a big fan of Catherine's work. So I would say, yeah, a happy and content society. And when I say that, it's realizing when enough is enough for everybody. So moving away from greed and also from a competitive capitalistic system that we live in. So that goes to what needs to change. I think the reform, even in our education system, needs to change. Our education system, our political system, the way we live, who holds the knowledge, who has the power, all of that needs to be reformed. So yeah, it's a big picture, a big ask, but for me, that's what a sustainable Scotland could look like. And again, thinking about what is good and what could stay the same. I think Scotland is unique in terms of its landscape, its natural environment. It's absolutely stunning and beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. I might be biased here, but yeah, I would say that. So let's not destroy our natural environment. Let's not put capital on our natural environment, and also the welcoming attitude that Scottish people do have to people coming from different parts of the world to Scotland and making them feel as if Scotland is home is really quite unique.
Thank you very much indeed, Zarina. We'll now hear from James.
Hey, thank you. I think there's a terrible risk that I might end up just repeating almost exactly what Zarina's just said, but I'll try to put a slightly different slant on it. I suppose thinking ahead to 2045, I just had a horrible vision. If I'm still around, I'll be 87 years old, and I can't really think of myself like that yet, quite. But I want to maybe just think about how we get to 2045 from here, and it seems to me that we're still in the midst of the COVID pandemic. It's not over, and it may revisit us in new and perhaps more challenging forms in the future. And I think one of the sort of things that is happening at the moment is people are talking about how do we come out of the pandemic, and it seems to me that there's a lot of rhetoric which is misplaced around this, because the pandemic is not the cause of the big current economic, social and political problems that we face, not just in Scotland, but right across the world. What the pandemic has done is it has exposed those problems. So for me, when I hear terms like building back and levelling up and global Britain, I feel very uneasy about those kind of terms, because to me they often seem to be disguising a kind of old hat and unimaginative program for recovery based on what I think is a completely unsustainable idea of growth, constant growth. And we have to get away from that. So the first thing I think that has to change is the attitudes of many of our political and economic leaders around what the economy is for, what our society is for. It seems to me it shouldn't be about constantly just growing and expanding, because that's why we've got into the mess we have around the present climate crisis. The climate crisis, as Alison Johnson's already said, it looms over every other issue we face. And while the planet burns or drowns, and while tens of millions of people are being displaced all over the world by a whole range of issues, and while we're losing ecological systems, either temporarily or with huge amounts of damage or completely, the model of recovery that we're being offered seems to be pretty much more of the same, only with a kind of greenish tinged makeup on the top, and that's not good enough. So it seems to me we have to really change not only our own personal attitudes, but also the whole sort of thing that generates how we do business, how we function as a society. We seem to be being told that if we, for example, if we switch from a carbon-based energy base to renewable non-carbon energy, we can just go on with the same acquisitive consuming lifestyle that is currently enjoyed by the most affluent parts of the planet. But actually, I don't think that's good enough. I think many of us, particularly those of us who live in the best, in the richest parts of the planet, will actually have to have less and buy less and use less than we presently do. There's plenty of other people in the rest of the world and within Scotland who need more than what they presently have, but they don't necessarily solely or even or even primarily need more material things. What they need is better health, better diets, better housing, better safety and freedom from persecution, better options and opportunities. And I think if we can start to think about those things as the most important things in people's lives, then actually we have a better chance of all of us being better off as a result. The flip side of that is that the pandemic has had some quite positive effects on people's thinking around this, I think. The pandemic seems to me to have shone a light on the values that many people, perhaps most of us, really appreciate and want to see given more primacy. Kindness, caring, fairness, a proper remuneration for essential jobs, particularly those jobs that aren't necessarily the most glamorous of jobs, and a redistribution not just of wealth but of power, the power to actually take decisions at a local level amongst communities and organisations and businesses as well, whose priorities are building sustainable, non-harmful, useful practices. And yes, we'll need to go on making things, but we want to be making things that are useful and durable, and if they're not durable, that are recyclable. So there's a whole range of stuff. I mean, I've got a whole list of other things, but I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, James. And now to Catherine.
And it's such a delight to be here. I'm really such a fan of Scottish Futures Forum, and particularly my fellow panelists, James and Zarina. It's really great to be on a panel with you. I want to share with you a few words of a sort of observation that was made. And these words are that the system that we find ourselves is not a success. It's not intelligent. It's not beautiful. It's not just. It's not virtuous. It doesn't deliver the goods. We're beginning to dislike and despise it. And those words feel very, very appropriate today. If you think about it, it's not a success. Well, we've got a planet of great wealth, while so many people still go hungry. We've got incredible communications and yet unprecedented levels of loneliness, not intelligent. When you think about how much spending from government or charitable effort goes into fixing and healing and repairing the damage that comes from our unequal, unsustainable economic systems, it's not beautiful. You only have to look at the nature scorched by the wild bushfires or the floods that have been raging across Europe to see that it's certainly not beautiful. It's not just. Well, you only have to look at the vertical and horizontal inequalities that are tearing our communities apart. It's not virtuous. We have to look at the extent of poverty alongside great riches, low life expectancy, and more people feeling anxious about their future. Doesn't deliver the goods. Well, look at the rise of food banks, the rise of in-work poverty and precarious work. And we're beginning to dislike and despise it. Well, you only have to look so far as people giving up on politics, entrenched views, and populist political agendas. And then those remarks, the person who wrote that said, but when we come to think about what to put in its place, we are extremely perplexed. Now, those words that I have read out for you were written by John Maynard Keynes in 1933. I think now in 2021, with all this human wisdom, we're a society that can collaborate to bring about vaccines for COVID in unprecedented times. We do know what to put in its place. And there is a plethora of different visions to how to transform the economy. And the idea of the well-being economy, the organization that I work with, it's named after the idea of the well-being economy. If you think of it, it's a bit like a picnic blanket that's rolled out on which all these other ideas to how to go about economic system change are welcome, whether that's regenerative economics, solidarity economics, donut economics, local economics, economy for the common good, the circular economy, and so on and so forth. All of those different schools of thought all have at their very core the idea that we need an economic system that is deliberately, concertedly designed for human and ecological well-being, which is in great opposition to the one that we currently have, as James and Zarina have pointed out, that this is a current economic system that is designed for and dependent on economic growth. So how do we go about trying to transform that economy? I'd like to think about the 4 Ps of realms of change that we need to look at. So one is purpose. How do we move away from a GDP-orientated measure of economic growth and economic success, putting collective, multidimensional well-being at the heart of how we judge how we're doing things and whether we're successful? The second is around prevention. Can we get beyond that patch and repair and heal after the damage is done and be more ambitious and look upstream and train our gaze there and stop the damage being done in the first place and stop patting ourselves on the back when we slightly redistribute the gap between rich and poor, or we sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and think we're heroic? That's no longer good enough. The third P is around pre-distribution, which is a really clunky term, but it's a fantastic concept. Essentially, it's about getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. This is about designing our economies in the way that they generate more equal, more just, more sustainable outcomes from the beginning. That takes us into questions around ownership, the nature of business models, how we price things, a community wealth building agenda. And the final P is around people powered. This is about putting people at the heart of economic decision making, helping them feel engaged, helping them feel part of those decisions that matter to their lives. And one of the questions that the presiding officer asked is, well, what needs to stay the same? And actually, I think very little. There is so much transformation that we need at all levels of our economic system. And for someone who moved to Scotland because I fell in love with this country, that is really hard to say, because there's a lot going on here that is amazing. But the problem is, it's a little bit too small. There's isolated pockets of good practice, and perhaps we can dive into this in the discussion later, whether it's the support for the worker cooperative movement, whether it's the existence of Zero Waste Scotland that's really trying to cultivate the circular economy, whether it's things like the business pledge where we're saying we have higher expectations of enterprises operating in Scotland, whether it's our amazing national parks, participatory budgeting initiatives, whether it's our welcome to refugees, whether it's even the national performance framework, and so on. There are so many examples of tentative steps that plant the seeds in the right direction. But a little bit like the Legos scattered across my nephew's floor, there's good stuff there. It's just not yet adding up into the systemic change that we need to see. And I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you all this evening to see how can we go about building on what we've already got to bring about the transformation in the economy that we really need. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for those, inspiring, inspirational, thought-provoking first responses. I think, Catherine, there you just spoke about the need for systemic change, and clearly that is what we need to see. We're long past the point of even hoping that individual behaviour change is going to get us anywhere near where we need to be heading. We've got a good question here from Cara Scott, and that's about, we obviously need systemic change, we need individuals to buy in and play their part, but how do we best, how can communities feel inspired to be involved in change, especially when eco-anxiety can be a problem, which can make people feel hopeless and just switch off when it seems so overwhelming. So how do we involve communities in that systemic change that we need to see? I'll go in reverse. Well, actually, I'll go to Catherine first, then Zarina, then James. Thank you.
Okay, Karis, it's a really lovely question and I think in a way, just allow yourself to take heart from the amazing work that is happening in communities around Scotland and around the world. And it's Zarina, I think, was going to give you hope some examples, ones that you work with, Zarina, but one I feel particularly inspired by is a community just outside Glasgow where I'm based, Linwood, that has a place that's had the industrial guts ripped out of it over decades. And then there was literally an attempt to impose an economic model that bore no resemblance to what local people there wanted. And so a group of local women got together and said, that's not for us. And so they talked to people in Linwood, they developed a vision, and they have fought for it for over a decade. And they are now building, I'd describe it as a wellbeing economy. They don't use that sort of words, but they would describe it as essentially an economy that works for people of Linwood on their terms. I've written about it on our website, so have a look there to get an exciting example of local women taking charge of the economic system, not asking for permission, and just getting on and building the sort of economy that they want locally. The other thing is, you know, the idea of eco-anxiety. I mean, I feel that. It was almost 20 years ago that my hometown was almost devastated by those bushfires that you saw again in Australia early last year. And it's so hard not to despair in the face of the pressure that we see on Mother Nature when we push her beyond what she can handle. The question is, though, do we hide away in that? Or do we join with the amazing movements, incredible enterprising businesses who are wanting to be part of the solution, amazing community groups, individuals who are linking arms and saying we can do better than this? So I just encourage you, there's no shortage of ways to get active, and it's through being active that you'll start to generate hope and start to feel that change is possible, because you'll not only be building it, but you'll be seeing more and more examples.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Zarina?
So it was really nice to hear a really positive story, but the struggle is true, and the struggle is there. It's not easy for communities to have that power to change things and reform things, because we live in a system, and unfortunately part of that system, especially for communities, is resources, is where the funding comes from, is where the money comes from, and that sometimes dictates what people do, and which is a shame, because the passion, the drive, the vision is there, but it's limited. It gets restricted by what our political system expects us to do, or what our education system expects us to do, or what the funder expects you to do and achieve, and what the outcomes are. So the outcomes are already kind of preordained in a way, where we're not allowed to flourish and visualize an alternative. And again, that was how I started off, by saying this is my idealistic world to live in. I know in a real life that that's so difficult. And again, with communities, and I suppose this is where the struggle lies, is not being allowed to be. And I think that's so important, that we listen, we step back, and we value what is coming out. And when I say communities, and I mean society, really, because we're all part of communities. And sometimes by putting the label of communities, we're kind of othering from like academic or from politics. But we're all a part of society. We all hold responsibility. So for me, I think it's very much about how do we become more interconnected? How do we support one another? How do we live more symbiotically? And I think if we start to provide that kind of support network, and I'm kind of visualizing this like trampoline underneath us, like this like net underneath all of us, that we're supported by one another, I feel as if then that eco-anxiety we can help and support one another through that eco-anxiety. And then thinking about, well, where does eco-anxiety come from, right? Where has that come from? That actually comes from a place where we're told that this is our problem and an individual level, that we must need to do something to change, right? And again, this isn't just an individual problem. Yes, we have a role to play, but it's a bigger political, systemic problem that we need to resolve. And it's about those leadership, it's about people in leadership taking responsibility and not just burdening the individual with that responsibility that somehow we as an individual can make the change. Yes, we can help and support it, but it's not just our responsibility.
Thank you very much, Zarina. And now over to James on that question.
Yeah, I would just echo a lot of what's just been said, and I don't think we should underestimate how difficult it is sometimes for people to feel that they have the right even to actually take control of their lives, because we're not very good in this in the United Kingdom. We're not very good at democratizing the way that decisions get made. You know, we're so used to the idea we go to the polls once every 4 or 5 years to vote in a lot of people who are supposed to act on our behalf. But actually, when you get down to the level of towns and cities and villages and communities, we don't really democratize very well down at that level. You know, there's not often a huge amount of enthusiasm for people to get involved in things like community councils and so on. And that's, I think, partly because we are constantly sort of we're told by other people that actually you won't be able to achieve very much. And I think one of the things that has come through in the last 18 months is that actually that's not true. One of the things that I live in a small village in Angus, a few miles away from Dundee. But one of the things about this village that really came to the fore over the last 18 months was that people were looking out for each other. People really cared and wanted to make sure that their neighbours were okay. And that's still there. People are weary now. I think, you know, we're all weary of the continuing issue around the pandemic. But there was definitely a strong spirit here, and I know it was repeated in lots and lots of other places right across the country, where people felt that they'd been given an opportunity to try and do something to help other people, to help their neighbours, to help their elderly neighbours who maybe couldn't get out and about very much and needed to have things brought to them, you know, and get their shopping done and all that kind of thing. That sort of community spirit, I think, can be tapped into over and over again, but you need to give people the sort of tools to do it. And one of the things, you know, that I haven't mentioned in my sort of what has to change in Scotland, I really think that we have to try as far as we can to devolve power away from the centre, but also down through the levels, so that we get to a place where people at really quite local levels feel that they can actually make a change by just getting up and doing things. And that there will be a political response from people further up the chain that says, yeah, we approve of what you're doing, we like what you're doing, and we're going to give you, if it's needed, we're going to give you some financial assistance to make it work. All of my experience of working in a whole range of issues is that actually stuff that comes from grass level up works much, much better than stuff that is top down delivered. If you can engage with people at the grass level, and so that they think that whatever the issue is, it's their issue, then they're much more likely to get engaged and to stay engaged with it. So, you know, again, to go back to Karat's question, it's not an easy issue, but I think that basically we have to just try and keep working at empowering more and more people at a local level.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was a really interesting response, as you would expect from our excellent panellists, but I was really struck there by James's ability he's actually answered the next question that came in, which was from Sheena Boyd, but I am going to put it to Zarina and Catherine now. And Sheena's question was, how do communities obtain the resources to follow through on their decisions? And James, of course, has just said absolutely devolve power, offer financial assistance where it's required. So I'd just be grateful, Zarina and Catherine, if you could pick up on that point. We'll go to Zarina first.
Yeah, I would agree with devolving power, but then again, I would just be a little bit weary about when we talk about devolving power that we're not putting a smoke cloud in front of people either, because with a lot of things around like land asset transfer or community asset transfer, a lot of it hasn't been about asset transfers, but actually a liability transfer. So it's pushing the responsibility onto those that may not have the resources, the capacity to do anything. So I'm quite weary about when we talk about devolved power and we talk about transferring, I suppose, power somewhere else, is, are we really giving the power, right? Are we really giving power up? So for me, it's like, yeah, we definitely need devolved power, but it has to be a very shared way of working, and also acknowledging there's differences. There's going to be differences. Not every community, not everybody is going to be in the same boat. And I think recognizing that is so important, that not everybody's in the same boat. We might be in the same seat, but we're not in the same boat. And it's how do we bring everybody up to the same level playing field? Because even with community development, it's some communities that have more capacity, more resources than other communities. So we don't want to leave communities behind by saying this is the way to go forward. We all need to be supported along the way. So yeah, I'm just a bit cautious about how we do it. But yes, it definitely needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Zarina. And finally, on that question, Catherine.
I'll be very, very brief because I'm keen to see some of the other questions as well. But I often think, to pick up on some of James's point, one of the best roles of government is essentially to underwrite community solutions, just to sort of put the resource there so that communities who know the challenges, who have the ideas for what can be done differently, can get on and do that without having to eke out a bit of a funding grant or a 6-month funding cycle and spend all their effort on that. They can just get on with delivering the solutions they want. But Zarina's points are really well made around, you can't just open the gates, because who's at the front of the queue there? The same communities, the same personalities, the same constituencies that are already benefiting from the current situation. That's where I'm really heartened by some of the experiments that we're starting to see to augment democratic processes beyond just voting every few years. We're seeing tentative steps with participatory budgeting, of course, through the Community Empowerment Act. Required about 1% of local government spending should be subject to participatory budgeting processes. I mean, that begs the obvious question, what about the 99%? How the hell is that deployed if it's not participatory? But maybe, 1% is better than nothing, isn't it? But also, of course, in Scotland, we've seen really great experiments in citizens' assemblies. And I'm a student of deliberative democracy, so I find this really, really heartening. And I've been involved in a small way in the Scottish Climate Assembly and the last year's Citizens Assembly. These are where you get 100 people who are recruited very, very carefully, because in total they are a mini Scotland. They're representative of Scotland in terms of age, education level, where they're based around geographically, their views on the topic at hand, level of disability, race, and so on. And it's quite extraordinary to speak to this group and see how they engage with each other. They take on board ideas and advice and technical expertise when it's offered gently, but it's very much in service of their deliberations. And when you read the reports that come from some of these exercises, and it's also worth you reading the UK one as well, you will see that when communities are given the chance in those circumstances, what they come up with in terms of their appetite for change is really bold. And it shows that there is no excuse for politicians to say, oh, the public aren't ready for this. Because when they have a chance to reflect and deliberate, they are up for the sorts of changes that we really need. So I guess I'd just add to the other answers to Sheena's question is we need more of those sorts of processes to augment the rather thin voting every few years mode of democracy. Important though that is as well, of course, presiding officer, I'll say that because that's vital, but we have to augment it with these other processes.
Yes, Zarina, please do come in here.
I'd like to add to the voting processes. I think it's also our relationships that what we have with politicians and how we hold them on a pedestal, that sometimes we give them power. We actually give people power to speak on behalf of us without actually really thinking that we've handed over our own power over to somebody else to represent us. So I think it's like thinking in a different way about what do politicians represent, who do they represent, and what power do we give them, and how do we take back some of that power that we've given them so that they are truly reflecting each and every individual in society. So I think it's also as society thinking about the role that politicians have and how we treat politicians.
Further on that point, we have a question from Esther Robertson, who was a former member of the Consultative Steering Group for the Parliament. And Esther is asking, how do we get our Parliament to revisit the founding principles of power sharing and participation and push power out closer to the people and move beyond consultation? I'll go to James first.
Quite a complex one, because I think, certainly thinking back to 1997 and then 1999 when the Parliament opened, many of us were absolutely full of optimism that this was going to be, the start of a new era, that the Parliament had the opportunity to really engage with the people who elected it, and to really try to share power and participation in a way that many of us felt Westminster hadn't done for perhaps decades or even centuries. And I think one of the things that happens with any political structure is that inevitably the political structure, whatever power it has got, it likes to keep it to itself. And this is not a criticism of Scottish Parliament or the Scottish political system that we have. It's just a fact of political life, I think. So I think it's a really, really good question that in fact the Parliament has to revisit where it started, what it has become, and then think about, well, are our committee, there was a lot of hope put into the committee system, and I think in many ways the committee system has done a lot of really good work, but perhaps it needs to be looked at again, and maybe we need to develop a new kind of structure. Catherine's mentioned the idea of citizens' assemblies, which is a brilliant thing. I love the idea that you can create mini Scotlands. But this is not a thing where people volunteer. They get asked to participate in these assemblies because that citizens' assembly is representative of the whole country. Otherwise, as Catherine already said, you get the same usual suspects coming through the front door to try and push their own interests. So maybe one of the ways that we can get the Parliament to revisit its own principles of power sharing and so on is to encourage more of that kind of thing, and to, in a sense, you kind of almost want an ongoing network of citizens' assemblies that are constantly consulting with people and constantly feeding back to the centre of power, which I suppose effectively is the Parliament. But even that's not probably enough because again, that kind of structure could get clogged up with the usual sort of vested interests and lobbying and so on that goes on all the time. So I'm not sure if I'm going to give Esther a very clear answer here, but it seems to me that we should be constantly looking again at what our political structures deliver and what it's not doing very well, and that could be about voting processes. I mean, I would like to see a change in the voting system to a proper proportional representation system. I think what we've got is infinitely better than first past the post. But I think we could actually improve that and make the Parliament more representative of the population than it currently is. And I think there are probably things that we could do similarly at a more local level, at council level and beyond. Again, I think it's brilliant that we have a PR system for local government elections. I mean, Scotland is so far ahead of other parts of the UK in many ways, but that's not a reason for resting on our laurels. I think we need to keep pushing at how far we can democratise the democracy we already have further in order to make it more reflective of what people really want their politicians to deliver.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. I'm going to go to Catherine with that question and then Zarina.
Okay. Another great question. And Esther, you know, I'm not normally a particularly grumpy person, but it's been a long day. And on this one, I am feeling a little bit depressed and grumpy because I think despite all those improvements that James has outlined in terms of the Scottish Parliament processes and things like festival politics, I mean, this is a great initiative to try to bring more voices, more ideas, more faces into political discussion. I mean, we still seem to have this outsourcing of thinking to unelected appointed advisory groups again and again and again. We've got probably one of the most important documents that's being written right now, the 10-year economic strategy for economic transformation, that instead of having even the consultation that most pieces of legislation would have, where there'd be open consultation, committees would call for evidence, there'd be structured evidence given, there was an email to send your comments to over summer for just a few weeks. It was extended by a week or so. I mean, it's hard to think of a more important document that's being crafted over summer without the mass involvement of things like citizens' assemblies and various other processes to really hear the voices of Scottish people in terms of their vision for economic strategy. So that's profoundly disappointing, let alone the budget process. And it's bizarre to me that other areas of the Scottish political scene have okay processes for opening up and bringing in people's voices and taking evidence. And then the budget process is almost like this black box where people don't understand it. How do we pay for, how do we design the budget flows, the flows of money? How do we choose what to resource? So there's sort of good and bad here. So I think we really need to keep going with this momentum and things like, this Community Empowerment Act, the Citizens Assembly, Participatory Budgeting are all part of it, but they're not yet enough. So I think it's certainly a case of the conversation and the effort is started, but it has to build up some momentum and build up speed, because at the moment we're not nearly where we need to be in terms of engaging people in governing of our country collectively.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Zarina, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I would just like to add on to what Catherine's just said about governing our society. So the governing of our society, I don't think should be passed on to others to do to us. I think it should be like self-governed. And when I say self-governed, I mean like each of us individually are involved in that. So my idea would be to have a community service. So we all have this responsibility to govern. So it's not imposed on us a community service. Like, when we think about community service, we think of it as a punishment, but not to think of community service as a punishment, but as an act of good, an act of a good deed that we're doing, an act of giving back and supporting one another. So thinking of community service in that way, changing the mindset of how we think about who does what and how we, instead of thinking about somebody does to us, it's like, well, how do we take that back and think, how can I contribute to my society? How can I contribute to what's going on? So I think if we change that, and I also think when we think about employment and jobs, and that should be in the same way, that when we think about a job, it shouldn't be about success in terms of materialistic, but actually, how am I serving my community by doing the job I do and the role I do? So that there's a much more enjoyment and fulfillment and satisfaction out of that.
Thank you very much indeed. I think it's fair to say that we'd recognise that each country and society's response will be influenced by their own individual culture and history. And I would... Are you okay there, James? Yeah.
Come in and say something after you've finished to add on to what Zarina had said.
Yes, certainly. Do you want to come in just now before we go on to the next question?
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think one of the issues that again needs to be addressed around which Zarina just touched on is we need to be very imaginative about how people go to work and where they go to work and how long they go to work in the week. I mean, we should, I think, be thinking very seriously about trying out minimum income schemes to see if they will work. We also, I think, should seriously think about moving towards a 4-day working week. Over human history, post-industrial history anyway, we have gradually been reducing the number of hours people commit to a job every week. And I think if we were able to free up people's time so that they weren't just feeling that, so often people feel that they go to work in order to make enough money to get by, but they don't actually have the time to stop and think as to why they're doing it, or if they stopped, what they would do differently. And I feel that there's a huge latent potential in many, many people that if they had a little bit more time to do the kind of things that Zarina's just been talking about in terms of community payback, they would willingly do it. But at the moment, they're too knackered to do it, and they don't have enough resources or money, perhaps at the end of the working week, to do anything with that either. So I feel that we should be being as imaginative as possible about moving towards different ways of working. And we've all got used to this, or many of us have got used to this in the last 18 months, about flexible working from home some of the time or all of the time. And we shouldn't just assume that we have to go back to the way things were before. This is where I think the pandemic is an opportunity for us to really experiment and try to bring in some new practices that enable us all to lead better lives, and perhaps therefore do some of the things, the positive things that Zarina has been talking about.
It's fair to say, and Catherine, I will get back to you in a moment, that we often do things because that's the way we've always done them, and the pandemic gives us an opportunity to stop and take stock. Many people's lives have changed markedly in the last year and a half or so, and we want to hang on to what's good. But what I was going to say there is, obviously each country and society's response is to the pandemic, to the challenge of climate change, to devastating biodiversity loss, can be influenced by culture and history. So I'd be interested in responding to the question we've just been discussing. Just because we've always worked a 5-day week, it's fabulous that new ideas are being explored at the moment because of the way we've changed what we do recently. But what aspects of Scottish culture do you think might help us meet these challenges? What aspects there might help or hinder us to undertake that transformation? And on that sort of question, Louise MacDonald is asking, what is the role of our arts and cultural communities to help us achieve that just transition? And she points to the power of storytelling as really important for amplifying and creating the opportunities to reach more decision makers. I mean, I think storytelling is obviously hugely powerful and impactful, and can get over complex messages or help you remember them in a way that you wouldn't if you're just presented with the bald facts. So there's a fairly wide-ranging one for you all to get stuck into. I think because Catherine had her hand up, I'll come to you first, Catherine, then Zarina, then James.
Okay, thanks ever so much. I just wanted to briefly, if it's okay, pick up on the 4-day working week first, and then I'll come to Louise's question. I think this idea of sharing work better is one of the key levers to bring about an economy that doesn't depend on growth and isn't reliant on growth. We have to wrap our heads around better distribution of work. I worry that the way we're currently talking about that has become sort of stuck with the moniker almost of 4-day week, when actually perhaps for some people working shorter hours but through a longer period of time might enable them to undertake other activities. So we don't want to be stuck in the sort of the box of it has to be 4-day week, which for a lot of people just mean doing a 6-day week in a 4-day time frame, more intense, more stressful, and then probably doing a bit of it unpaid afterwards as well. And so we need a plethora of tools in the toolbox, whether it's term time working, more public holidays, shorter working hours throughout the week, and just really sort of cracking open some of the way we design jobs as well, so that perhaps we have 2 people doing a job that we previously thought had to be one person working 80 hours. And this is about getting creative with the circles we draw around different tasks and divvying them up differently. We need to attend to the costs of how we currently tax jobs and tax income. So often it's per worker rather than per hour. And so that's an encouragement effectively to work fewer people longer hours, get more overtime rather than distribute the work more fairly. So it's a really complex question. There was a great report out just recently from IPPR Scotland that's really worth diving into, and also the organisation Autonomy based down in London are doing a lot of work on this. So I'd urge everyone to pile in on that. I'm going to be really brief on Louise's question because I think there's two other people on the panel who are much better to answer this than I am, other than to say, I think one of the biggest barriers that gets us stuck in those path dependencies that presiding officer just alluded to is our limited imaginations. Back in 1983, Ronald Reagan said there are no limits to growth because there are no limits to our collective imaginations. And I think now it's our limited imaginations that are stopping us envisaging and building an economy that is better than economic growth. We're stuck in those old 20th century recipes, trying to find solutions to 21st century problems. And so we need storytellers and artists to help us imagine and see and bring to the fore the examples of what change looks like that are already happening around the world. Because there's no shortage of practice. We know what this looks like. We see it in microcosm. And what we need is folks to help us communicate this and make sure it's exciting and energizing and hopeful rather than change that's imposed upon people, which will happen if we don't wrap our heads around and manage the transition. If we just stay with business as usual, change will come. It'll just be extraordinarily disruptive and not on our terms. So we need to be on the front foot on this. But just to say really, welcome, and we desperately need all sectors of the arts and cultural community to help us with this. At the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we've got a platform called Stories for Life, where we're working with artists and storytellers and advertisers, folks who can help us think about ways to frame some of these conversations in language that's exciting and compelling and energizing. So it's a free resource, so everyone's welcome to dive into that. It's Stories Life, I think, just stories.life, I think. But over to my much better qualified panelists to answer that more.
Thank you very much to Zarina. How might Scottish culture help or hinder us? And what can the arts bring to this debate?
I think art and culture is fundamental for any change, but also for communication. It's a massive tool, under-resourced, undervalued tool for communicating. And I think there was somebody else's question, Lily Hunter's question about working class, and how do we engage them. But I think arts and culture is one way to engage a lot of marginalised communities, because sometimes the science, the data, the jargon, the terminology is actually off-putting because people don't relate to it. It's not relevant to their day-to-day lives, whereas art and culture is very much their day-to-day life, their bread and butter, what they understand, how we can communicate. And it can be invigorating, it can be inspirational, it can be all of these things that Catherine was saying, that art and culture brings so much richness to our lives. And I think a definite place for art and culture is much needed in these spaces. And I don't know why we can't have them side by side with science and data. It's like one or the other. And we live in this very binary world where things are right or wrong. And rather than thinking of like a journey and a pathway that we're all on, bringing everyone in together. So an example of how I've used art and culture is I've got a group of women that I work with at the moment, local women from Glasgow that I've got connections to different parts of the world. And these are women that would not normally be involved in like COP26 or in any kind of political place. But what they've done is they've taken a climate crisis that they're passionate about. These would be women that, would be like, what do they know about climate change? If you were like talking to like the think tanks or political leaders. And they've actually created an exhibition, or going to be creating an exhibition based on something, an art piece that they're interested in. When I say art piece, I'm talking about using podcasts, using plastic materials to make jewellery, using upcycled materials to make a dress, and talking about the impact of the textile industry in other parts of the world. Poetry, using poetry to tell a story, using music. So there's all different forms of art and culture that they're bringing, and they're connecting it to their own home countries, their home cultures, as well as combining it to what's happening in Scotland. So I think it's such a way to get those underrepresented and marginalised voices to be heard.
Thank you very much, Zarina. Over to James on the culture question.
I would just want to maybe draw a bit of a distinction between arts and culture. Culture, it seems to me, is who we are and how we live every day. And culture is one of those words that can cover just about every aspect of our daily lives. Art and artistic responses to things, I think, are a little bit different, although they are also part of culture. And I have to say, I'm always a wee bit wary when I hear the idea that art is a great tool that can be utilised to get messages across. I think it's true, and it absolutely can work like that. But I'm always a wee bit wary of art and whether it's literature, music, painting, drama, whatever, being appropriated by politicians because they think it's going to serve their purposes. So I'm a wee bit wary about that. One of the things that I think that artists can do, though, is that they can bring a really perceptive, critical eye to what is going on. And through their art, again, whether it's a poem or a film or dance or any kind of artistic output, they can actually kind of deliver a critique of the society in which they're living, which can be both a positive and a negative thing. So they can say, look, we are applauding this because this is brilliant, but we're also pointing out this aspect of what's going on is really crap and it's not good for the people who are having to be on the receiving end of it. So culture can, sorry, I need to get my terminology right here. Arts and the things that artists in the widest form of that word do can be incredibly important in that respect. I want to say that everybody can be a cultural activist. Every single person could be a cultural activist because culture is who we are and what we do. And at that level, you know, it is something that feeds into the political discourse, the discourse about what makes a society function. What is an economy for? Is it for the people, or is it for the people who are making lots of money? You know, all of those questions can be unpacked through both the culture that people use and are part of every day, and also from the things that artists do. Artists are very good at asking questions, which they don't necessarily have to provide the answers to, and that's okay. I think asking questions is sometimes a really, really important thing to do. I think that's part of the role, to answer Louise McDonald's question. That's what artists can do. But I think that everybody has the opportunity to also make their own contribution to that, because everybody, at one level at least, everybody is an artist in their own right, because the way they live their lives every day is a kind of cultural activity.
Thank you all. I have a question from Wendy now. I think it's a really important question. What do you feel is the hook to get people interested in sustainability? People might feel that they're losing something immediately. For example, you know, take less flights, buy less disposable fashion, but they're losing things for an outcome that they are unlikely to see immediately, potentially for a long while, you know, halting or slowing climate change. So what's that motivation? How do we hook people in? I'll go to Catherine first, then Zarina, then James.
I needed some time to think about this one. It's really good and very fine question. I mean, in a way, I think some of these gains can be realised quite quickly. And take, for example, pollution. Very quickly, our streets will be less polluted. Very quickly, our parks will be more fun, you know, nicer places to be in. Very quickly, you know, our lungs will feel clearer, we'll be healthier. And so some of these ripple effects aren't 10, 20 years off. And also, I guess, the reality is people are starting to feel the impacts closer to home and more immediately and more ferociously now. I mean, we can't just dismiss climate change, as I think a lot of people rather complacently and perhaps rather almost racistly did in the past, of thinking this is something that happens to the global south, which abhorrent though that implicit attitude is, we're now seeing unprecedented heat waves across North America, killing people. And of course, I think there's a question around sort of the class dimension and socioeconomic income dimension here that I think is really important to reflect on as well, because we know that the climate and environmental crisis is a social justice question in the story of who it is who's putting most pressure on the planet, but equally in terms of who it is who's most affected. It's going to be folks on lower incomes who are most affected by polluted streets, who won't have insurance to repair their buildings after a dramatic weather event, who won't be able to afford air conditioning in unprecedented heat waves, and who are more likely to die prematurely because of that. So these two questions are intimately connected, and I think we need to, when we're talking about solutions, this goes to Wendy's question, talk also about the benefits will come to those communities. And this is where I think things like the Just Transition and the Green New Deal agenda really come into their own, because one of the things they implicitly say, especially the Green New Deal, is that we need to ensure that groups of people who are most shafted by the previous economic system are those very groups of people that need to be first served by the transformation. We need to make sure these are the communities that are at the front of the queue for the jobs, that are at the front of the queue to get their houses retrofitted so they're more energy efficient, that are at the front of the queue to be able to take part in some of the decision making that we've talked about. And so I think, Wendy, that's part of it, is really talking about the multiple benefits that can ripple out across if we do this right. And ultimately, this is not a story of deprivation or giving up. This is a story of possibility of shorter working weeks, nicer local communities, more time to spend with communities, healthier physical and mental experiences as well. And so there's lots of benefits that can flow from this if we take the time and are able to have those conversations.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll go on to Zarina now, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same as Catherine there, is talking about the benefits, very much not talking about, I suppose the media and climate deniers have actually part of these messages of like having less and going back to the Stone Age and doing without. And it's not about that. It's about how do we move forward to have a better life for all, a better, healthier, happier life that we can all have, a happier life, not just for us individually, but also for the planet and the other inhabitants on the planet. And I know that's quite difficult for people that might have like financial pressures and to think beyond their own issues and problems. But if we can connect it to other social justice issues, it's really important. So it's not just climate justice, but it's bringing within that umbrella of climate justice is all the other social justice, that if we work towards a better and more sustainable world, we're actually tackling all the other injustices in society, and we're bringing a fairness to this world and this planet. And for me, I think that's probably the hook, and it's not always an easy hook to bring in, because not everybody can get their head around thinking beyond their own issues, their own problems, their own priorities. It can be quite difficult. And again, that's where I think we need that societal shift, that we're not just individualized. It's not just about me, but it's more about how are we connected to other people in our society, how are we connected to our community, but then also how is Scotland connected to other parts of the world. Yes, what happens in Scotland does have an impact on other parts of the world. We do have to remember that and recognise that as well. So I think it's that being connectedness, we need to kind of establish that and bring that to the forefront as well.
Thank you. So James, what do you feel is the hook to get people interested in sustainability?
Well, I think a really, really important hook doesn't actually apply to me because I don't have children, but I think the really important hook is for people to think about their own children, because that is the thing that will make them think, okay, I might not be around to see all the benefits of the long-term change towards sustainability, but my children are going to be around, my grandchildren are going to be around. I've got nephews and great-nephews and nieces as well, so I can, even somebody like myself who doesn't have their own children, can think about the next generations and how important it is that we try to get this stuff right for them. But I also think that works the other way too, because young people are often absolutely the biggest enthusiasts to getting some of this stuff sorted, so they can educate the adults in their lives as well. And schools are often brilliant breeding grounds for new ideas about how to get involved in sustainability. And if you think about, we've all now been, for I don't know how many years, 20, 30 years, we've been recycling and, as households. And it's often the children in the household that are really, really keen to make sure that we recycle things properly and that we get the glass in the right bits and, we separate out the things so that the recycling works properly. And so I think that, to me, is one of the biggest hooks we can use, is that those of us who are a bit older actually need to work with people who are really young, sometimes, people who are 4, 5, 6 years old, but also teenagers and people of that age as well. Because I think they are absolutely keen on this. They really know that it's going to affect them and their lives, and so they're probably the biggest hook that we can use to get their parents and grandparents and everybody else engaged in it.
Thank you. I think it's clear we're moving towards the end of our time. We have got a lot of questions to get through. So what I'm going to do the next little while is just ask you, I'm just going to pose a question to one panellist at a time. I'm going to go to Zarina with the next one, and I think it sort of links in nicely to the point that James was just making there. And that is, what do you think about embedding sustainable training within our educational system and workforce? And that's a question from Colin Grieve.
Yeah, I think definitely we have to normalise what sustainability means, what environmental issues are, being connected to nature, because at the moment our education system is all about growth. It's all about our own personal growth, economic growth, material success. So what do we measure? What is success measured by? So I think in our education systems, it's not just about incorporating sustainability, but actually thinking about, well, what are we actually teaching our children? What is our education teaching in order to get to a sustainable lifestyle? So how do we normalise sustainability in our everyday lives? And that includes in our education system. So it's not an add-on subject. So that's what I don't want to see it just being, this is like for people that are interested in sustainability. So they do that because that's what they're interested in. This has to be embedded right through each and every subject. And it's about our lifestyles and the life that we want. For me, so that's where it takes a place within the education system. And again, it's moving away from having this competitive education system that we have, which is all about getting the results for the school, getting the results for yourself, being the top person, and it's all about me. And it's not about me and my place within the society, but it's about me only. And I think that's where the role of education really needs to change and incorporate sustainability, environmental as throughout all of it, not a standalone subject.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put this next question to James, and it's still on that educational theme. And this is a question from Glenn. How can we as a nation hold our universities to account so that they move away from a capitalist business model and embrace a well-being economic model that nurtures the seed beds that Catherine evokes so that they flourish?
Well, that's a big question as well, isn't it? Yes, I guess the point being made here is that the universities have changed. It seems to me in my adult lifetime, they've changed from being primarily centres of educational excellence into being more like businesses. And there's an awful lot of things that I think have gone wrong with the university sector. They are now often about getting as many students through their doors as possible who they seem to treat as customers rather than as people who are there to actually, become, as it were, more rounded people with fuller educational opportunities and leaving at the end with a whole set of valuable tools, not just for their own future careers, but for giving back to society. So there's a whole load of things that I think need to be addressed there. And that's, I guess we, in Scotland, I think we're fortunate in that we have not gone completely down that road as has happened in other parts of the world and in other parts of the UK, but we've gone a long way down it. And I think we need to have a really serious think about what universities are for. But I think you can't entirely separate them out from the rest of the education system. And Zarina's already pointed to the fact that so much of our education system almost from primary school, but certainly from secondary school onwards, is about competition. And I think that needs to change. We've got Curriculum for Excellence has been in position for some time now. And actually, I think the basic aims of Curriculum for Excellence are really laudable. I think they're very good. Just to remind ourselves, the four principles of that is that they want to produce successful learners, confident individuals, effective contributors, and responsible citizens. That's all pretty good. The difficulty is delivering that in an education system that can't stop. It's constantly having to process large numbers of learners every single year through their secondary education. And the expectations of those learners and their parents and the businesses that are then going to go and employ them, I think there's a gap between the basic aims of Curriculum for Excellence and what people expect education to do for them. So again, I think it's a long process. I mean, having worked in education from the sidelines quite a lot, I know how difficult it is to make the huge anchor of education turn a couple of degrees. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of time to make it shift. But I do think we have to have a really serious look about what our education is doing to our children and our young adults, but also what is it for? And it's the same question about what is our economy for? What is our education for? To me, it should be about giving people the opportunities to lead the best, fullest lives that they can, but not at the expense of other people. I fear that I might not have answered the question properly, but I'll probably stop there because it's a huge question and I think it's a really important one.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Michael Cook, and we began this evening, speaking about the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And I feel as often happens, there's more of a focus on climate change. Now, Michael Cook's question is, we failed to deliver the policies that are going to, address biodiversity loss. This other existential threat that we face. How do we address this? And I'm going to put that absolutely mammoth question. I think this is Catherine's turn.
Thanks, and thanks, Michael. I mean, I think the premise of the question is brilliant because so much, a lot of discussion about the environment comes down to carbon and climate change and net zero. And all of those are clearly partial. So the environmental crisis is much bigger than climate change and biodiversity loss. We've got scientists warning of the sixth mass extinction already. But if you take the science around planetary boundaries seriously, we're also talking about problematic land use change and nitrogen and phosphorus cycles as well. So we need to have a much broader lens when we're looking at what's happening to the environmental crisis rather than just the climate crisis. So I think it's a really, really good point. And I think in a way, we have talked about some of the answers already because we've said what we need to do is understand the interlocking nature of the environmental crisis as a social justice question, two sides of the same coin. And I use that metaphor coin deliberately because it is the economy. that links the two. And the only way we will grapple with those interlinked challenges is by looking at how we structure our economy, what we price, who's winning and who's losing, what sort of incentive structures, how we design businesses, what their purpose is, all those questions around the nature of our economic ecosystem. What sort of businesses do we need to flourish in a wellbeing economy in Scotland? And there are plenty of examples of those sort of businesses that we need more of. And look, I'll give you one example. Right, this is the engine from a toaster that comes from an amazing network called the Remade Network that's all about repairing and reusing, reducing use of, let alone recycling our products, our material products, so that the material resources within a toaster stay in the cycle. So we don't just have that linear model of take, waste and throw away. There's so many good examples of this. And Louise will know one of my favorite examples, Louise, who's on this call, is an amazing brewery. I don't know if you can see that, called Jaw Brew. This is a fantastic brewery just in Mulgai here. They are constantly thinking how they can be more circular. And what they do is they make a line of beer using old bread from Ald's Bakery. They don't tie up their cans with little plastic rings because we know all the damage that does to sea life. They use biodegradable sort of imitation plastic made from prawn shells. So I share these examples to illustrate that there are solutions out there. We know what this looks like. There are the seeds of change there. What we need is to take those Lego pieces, like the ones on my nephew's floor, bring them together into the larger scale systemic change that adds up to a different sort of economy, rather than having these nice examples existing on the margins of a growth-orientated, growth-dependent economy.
Thank you very much. Oh, now, Zarina, I'm going to let you in here very quickly. Thank you.
It's just about these alternative options that are out there on the market that I struggle with, because they're not accessible to many people, because they're overpriced. Well, I don't want to say overpriced, because they probably are priced at the right level because it costs more. But the point is that they're not affordable for a lot of communities, and a lot of people just can't afford to get organic. They can't afford to get like plastic alternatives. So it's about bringing a fairer society in terms of things being accessible to all, is what we should continue working towards. I think it's like it should be for all. We should keep thinking that, bringing back that idea that this is for all in society, and that we leave nobody behind in society when we're moving forward. So I just wanted to bring that point in, because I'm quite conscious that it's really difficult for many communities that I work with that can't access things that they would like.
Thank you very much. I think that is a point well made. So we have just over 5 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions I'd really like to put to the panel. And if we could aim for, I know this is really challenging, I've experienced this myself in many hustings, but if we could aim for, say, a sentence or so. I'm going to come at you with one question, and then I'm going to come at you with another as we head towards the conclusion of our evening. So, this is from Anne Packard. If you were to suggest to Mrs. and Mrs. Average one action they and their children could take to make a difference, what would that action be? And I'm going to go to James, and then Catherine, and then Zarina. I shouldn't have told you which order, should I? I should have kept you on the spot. So what's the one action that Mr. and Mrs. Average should take, James?
Well, I'm going to be brutal here and say try to stop flying. I think there's lots of issues, but I think we've all got so used to doing things without thinking about them, and I think I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, that some of us are going to have to do less of what we currently do, and allow other people a bit more than they currently have. Flying around the world seems to me to be a big issue, and I think that we should maybe try to stop, do less of it than we might otherwise have done, pre-pandemic.
Thank you. And Catherine?
And for me, it's having more of these sorts of conversations. So have these conversations with anyone in your sphere of influence, whether it's your taxi driver or your auntie or someone that you happen to be having coffee with, to help us open up and ask these hitherto forbidden questions about the nature of the economy, around what is the purpose and the role of the economy. Is it an objective in its own right, or should we be designing the economy so that it's vibrant and it flourishes and it delivers prosperity in order to deliver higher order goals of social justice on a healthy planet? And until we open up those conversations, we won't be able to take the action that we need. So for me, it's just use every conversation that you can to help people ask harder questions of the economy.
And Zarina?
It's don't be a sheep and start becoming conscious consumers. So engage your conscious awareness when it comes to what you're buying, how you're buying it. Think about, do I really need it? Do I want it? Am I comfortable from where this comes from? So being that conscious, having that conscious awareness when it comes to consumerism.
Thank you. If you thought that was the only question I was going to ask you to respond to in one sentence, you were not correct. So, if you had absolute authority to do one thing, whatever you wanted, but to do one thing now to change our society, what would it be? I'm going to go to Catherine first.
This is such a tricky question. Right, for me, it's about piling on support for cooperative business models that put workers and communities in control of business rather than extractive business models. These are successful, viable businesses delivering amazing creative innovations, meeting community needs, but doing so to serve the needs of their members rather than some remote shareholders. And Scotland has a great record on this, dating way back to Robert Owen's New Lanark. So piling on those sorts of business models.
Zarina, with your absolute authority, what do you do?
Yeah, it's quite similar to Catherine. So I would say localised ownership and development of local resources. And when I say local resources, I mean things like energy, food, our own food systems, our own businesses, our own jobs. What does a job look like? So in a way where we're all connected to one another and we all have this symbiotic relationship with one another.
I should make clear in my position as chair, I don't actually believe that absolute authority and the sustainable society go together. That being the case, I put this question to James. What would you do with your absolute authority?
I would immediately ban the sale and then subsequently the manufacture of weapons and arms. I just feel that this is such a huge question. You know, we're busy often exporting absolute misery and disaster to other parts of the world, and we need to stop doing it. And so, yeah, I would put an immediate ban on the sale and manufacture of arms.
Thank you all. Now, I can promise that this will be the last time I put you on the spot and ask you for a one-sentence response. So, imagine it's 2045. What do you want to be the same about Scotland? And I put that question to Zarina.
The same about Scotland, I think it would probably be the landscape of Scotland. I don't want our natural environment to be exploited in any way whatsoever.
Thank you. And James, what should remain the same?
I hope that in 2045, Scotland is still an argumentative place. I think we absolutely need to be able to have civilised but robust arguments and discussions with each other about where we're going. One of the things I think is really important is that we don't get into ideological wars that put us into tribes, because the past tells us that sometimes that's where we make the biggest mistakes of all. You know, it's not that long ago that the Fife coalfield was being developed and we were told we were going to be having 100 years worth of coal that was going to fuel all our needs. That went. Nuclear energy was going to be too cheap to meter. That's not worked out. So we need to be able to continue to have constructive but robust arguments about all of the things, because it may turn out that some of the things we think are going to work in the future won't work, and we'll need to be flexible enough to be able to change our route towards sustainability.
Thank you. I concur wholeheartedly. with the desire to have robust but civilised debate, James. Won't be surprised to hear that. There's so many, important discussions that we have to have, and we have to be able to disagree with one another in a passionate but civilised manner. Catherine.
I'd say something very similar to Zarina and James, which just shows what a lovely hour and a half it's been. And I'm afraid you didn't get much of a debate. It was more mutually reinforcing and augmenting what each other's saying. But absolutely, the landscape, we can't change that. It will be disaster if we're growing champagne grapes in 25 years' time or so, because it would show how much the climate had changed. Let's protect our extraordinary landscape, but also I hope that cheeky irreverence that first drew me to Scotland alongside the landscape over 16 years ago is still there, and we're still taking the mickey and laughing together with each other, and having these sorts of conversations more and more in the future.
Thank you all very much. I mean, time is against us, so I'm afraid that I'll have to bring this evening's event to a close. I'd like to thank those who've worked so hard behind the scenes to put on this debate, our incredible panel for their ideas and their vision. Thank you, Zarina, Catherine, James. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all of you at home who have attended and put such fabulous questions forward. And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to get through them all. The role of people in our communities and our everyday choices, and as voters and part of wider society, is absolutely vital in building our future. I think this evening's discussion has made that very clear, and it'll be ever more important over the coming years. Now, the Scottish Parliament exists to make life better for people in Scotland, and we can do that only by working with you at all times, whether that's through providing authoritative information from the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre, engaging the public through our petitions protest and the process, and sometimes it's protest, and the work of our committees, or in holding events like this to support debate and ideas. This Parliament is for you. And as I said earlier, this evening's discussion is part of the Parliament's Festival of Politics in 2021, which will look to our shared future and the climate and nature challenge ahead. The programme will be launched later this month, and in what promises to be crucial autumn for our future, we hope you will be able to join us at the events. For now, though, thank you and goodbye.